Welcome everyone. In this lecture, this evening, at least here this evening, I don't know from where you are looking, so good morning, maybe good afternoon. In this lecture we will examine peace from the Theosophical perspective on freedom and free will. We will look at both ourselves as individuals and how we can contribute to the whole. Why is this so important? Of course, everyone wants peace. Everyone wants freedom. But you can ask yourself, do we have a really clear perspective on what that means? And let's say we have, to what extent is our perspective shared by others? Or you might say even something universal. For example, are we really peaceful and free when we have no war? And can you really speak of peace in one country when there is war somewhere else in the world? Are we separate from that? And is there really peace when there is also so much discontent we see around us? And what about freedom? Is there really freedom when one person's freedom comes at the expense of another's? All this has everything to do with free will. But do we have free will to begin with? And to what extent is our will free if we are also continually constrained by circumstances? Now, the Theosophical view of free will offers a different view of what freedom means and how it can lead to lasting peace, as something active and dynamic that we can all bring about. To understand this, in this lecture we will discuss the doctrine of karma. The doctrine of karma is often misinterpreted and misunderstood. But proper understanding of this doctrine is essential to rise above war and temporary peace to achieve lasting peace instead. And that understanding has everything to do with the fundamental free will of every living being. So that's why in this lecture we will first focus on the question, what is free will according to Theosophy? And to answer that question, we'll reflect on some principles first. And then we will look at the meaning of freedom and of peace. In the second part we will go further into the doctrine of karma. And in the third part we will end the lecture with the question to ourselves, how can we contribute to freedom and peace using our free will? Now, for the newcomers, universal wisdom or Theosophia can be reduced to only three principles, three propositions or main tenets. And the first is that there is boundlessness. In the secret doctrine, the magnum opus of Madame Blavatsky, who founded the Theosophical Society, this boundlessness is described as an omnipresent, eternal, boundless and immutable principle. A very fundamental idea, which you can think about for a very long time. First, boundlessness means without borders, without boundaries. Now, we often talk about borders, but they are actually imaginary. Consider, for example, land borders at sea. Even if you define it by a coastline, you still don't have a fixed frontier. Because if you were to zoom in on the coast, you will see that everything changes constantly. Everything is moving, just like the boundaries on our own bodies. We can see that change from day to day, even from second to second, if you were to observe it through a microscope. Now, that movement is everywhere. We can also see that everything reacts to each other. It does so continuously, constantly. There is no beginning to it, no end. And I take physical examples now with sea boundaries, matter and the boundaries of our bodies. But also in our thinking there is boundlessness. Our thoughts too are constantly moving and changing. And our thinking is also continuously interacting with both the outer world and what is going on inside of us. So you see the continuous movement as well as in the outer world, the physical, that we can perceive as in our inner world. There are no boundaries there. We are constantly changing of ideas, changing, our thinking is constantly moving. Now, to understand that boundlessness to some extent, we often use metaphors. And one such metaphor is that of the boundless ocean. You can say that each being is like a wave in that ocean. And that wave itself consists of even smaller waves or ripples, which consist of even smaller ripples, etc. But in essence, every wave or ripple is that ocean, and inseparable from that ocean and also from all other ripples or waves in that ocean. Now, the source of the movement that such a wave or ripple makes also extends to infinity. Think of waves that come from the wind which is created by weather conditions partly determined by the position of the Earth relative to the Sun, movements in the solar system that in turn are influenced by cosmic conditions, etc., etc. You could say that behind that is the boundlessness. So behind everything that acts and reacts, you could say is that same boundless force. In short, everything is essentially alive. There is boundless potential behind every phenomenon. And if you assume boundlessness, then there are therefore never new things that are added. Everything was already there in essence, and everything will always be there. And this sometimes goes a little over our heads, especially I can imagine when you hear this for the first time. We're not used to thinking in eternity and omnipresence or boundlessness. But assuming boundlessness, there's also an infinite wisdom possible, something far beyond our average thinking. Hence, at the introduction of this fundamental proposition in the Secret Doctrine, it is also stated that this principle is one on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. That is not to say that one cannot reflect on it. Indeed, ultimately, all of our thinking is based on propositions or assumptions, and what really matters is whether their conclusions match our experience of reality. So an important conclusion from this proposition is that everything basically is alive and has essentially boundless potential. Now let's relate that to ourselves for a moment. Starting from boundlessness, every being can be seen as a ray of the boundless, a stream of consciousness. Now the second proposition also speaks of sparks of eternity that appear and disappear cyclically and ceaselessly. And that spark is also called the monad. That monad is the imperishable part in every being. It is such a cyclic, manifesting wave in the boundless ocean, a spark of the boundless fire, a ray of the boundless sun. We use metaphors because words often fall short here. But an essential conclusion here is from the proposition of boundlessness. There's an essential conclusion for what we call free will. Because if you start from that proposition, then every particle, however minute, is likewise boundless. So everything essentially also has free will. And we then come to the third proposition, that is the fundamental identity of every being. So every being has the same boundless potential and also fundamentally has free will. But it does not mean that every being can also fully express that free will. But even though the weight of the entire universe presses on one single atom, there's nothing that can limit the small amount of free will in that atom. And then we come to the next part of our composite, the learning part. That is the part that makes a being what it is. It is that part of the boundless consciousness of the monad that a being has learned to express and is also currently learning to express further. Now, we already indicated that every being has essentially free will. So the potential is the same for every being. But there is, of course, difference in the degree to which each being expresses it, like we said before. A stone does not express the potential of a plant. A plant does not express the potential of an animal. And an animal does not express that of a human being. And a human being does not express that of a Buddha or a God. So finally, every learning part, whether of a plant, animal or human, also uses a vehicle. A vehicle that is itself composed of countless other beings, but then at the atomic level, a microcosm into itself. And that vehicle is appropriate for each being to express the learning consciousness. So in short, free will has nothing to do with doing whatever you want, as it is sometimes being superficially understood. If you just think about that for a moment, you will quickly admit that that idea is an illusion. There are always others we have to deal with. Yes, there is interconnectedness. Now, free will can also be defined in Theosophy as the inherent divine power in every being to choose. You can also call it the inner driving force, the force behind all things, or life force. And that force is transformed by the learning part. So it has its origin in the imperishable part, in the monad, in that spark of the boundless, and is transformed by the learning part. And so there can be a large expression or a limited expression of that free will, depending on what the being so far has been able to express. Now, this will can be seen as an expression of the power of desire. Gottfried de Berucker, the second or the fourth leader of the Theosophical Society, describes it as follows: back of will lies desire, and back of desire lies consciousness. Now, will is aimed at achieving things, setting things in motion, creating effects, and that's a neutral force, and that force of desire is guided by the underlying consciousness. So the degree of consciousness also determines the degree of our free will. The greater the evolution of consciousness, the greater the free will. Simple example. If you go to a foreign country where they speak a different language, Chinese for example, you have limited freedom of movement. You depend on people who speak English, have to plan routes in advance, etc. However, if you have some knowledge of the language, even just a little, your freedom increases immediately. And on a slightly larger scale, of course, we also see this clearly with the difference between, for instance, human and animal consciousness. Thanks to the ability to think, we as human beings have been able to overcome our instincts. And at the same time, this also shows that this growth of consciousness and of our free will is immediately accompanied by greater responsibility. We rightly do not accept it when a human being only follows his instincts. And with our thinking and ability to reason, to plan and create, we also have more impact on the whole. So our responsibility increases correspondingly. Now we can understand this better if we zoom in a little further on the composite nature of human consciousness. We can also divide this triad that we introduced you to, if we divide that further into 7 principles, the names of which are here in Sanskrit. Now we as human beings are currently learning to express the 5th principle from below, the manas or thinking faculty. And that thinking faculty can itself also be divided into 7 aspects of thinking or aspects of thought. And each of those aspects corresponds to one of those 7 principles. And we, for instance, think physically when we identify with our body and say I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, or I'm tired. And when we identify with our emotions or our feelings, we are anxious, sad, happy, or angry, for example. Vitality means that we think by doing, are constantly busy, cannot sit still. The thinking aspect of desire refers to our longings, and these can be focused outwardly on material possessions, for instance, or certain appearances, but can also be focused inwardly on, let's say, getting a certain status or perhaps wisdom. The intellect is our rational reasoning and our ability to categorize things. Then we have our insight or understanding, which stands above our intellect and can put things into context, can bring coherence and understanding. And also idealism is a form of this type of thinking. And finally, there is the sense of unity or inspiration, when we feel ourselves completely absorbed in the whole. The rare mystical experiences are examples of this. Now we can identify with each of these thinking aspects. And on average, we are somewhat less at home in the higher thinking aspects than in the lower ones. In our current stage of human evolution, on average, we are mainly engaged in bringing the thinking aspects of desire and of intellect to mastery, with occasional flashes of insight, intuition, or idealism. So also, you can say, correspondingly, our free will is sevenfold, based on this sevenfold thinking. And we see that the sevenfold will goes from low to high, from limited to broad, from outer to inner. From identification with our outer body to the underlying unity of everything. The sevenfold will is also good to keep in mind when we look at what we understand by freedom and peace. With the definition of free will and the inherent divine power to choose, we can also define the concept of freedom. Theosophically, you could say this is the ability to express your essentially boundless potential. And it's synonymous with the development of consciousness. So freedom is not so much something that comes from outside, but much more something that arises from within ourselves. And put another way, it means expressing as many aspects of thinking as possible, as seen from our standpoint from human evolution. So for us, in our current stage of evolution, the challenge is especially to activate the 6th and 7th thinking aspects. The capacity for understanding or insightful thinking, idealistic thinking, and also the thinking from a sense of unity. And this is also essential to achieve peace. Why is that? Because peace is theosophically synonymous with harmony, you could say. And harmony, and therefore peace, can be defined as the right interplay of action and reaction in any situation. Think of the interplay in music, for example. And when we play music, we also respond to each other. We respond to our fellow musicians. And in a sense, this also applies to society as a whole. Now, peace, in a sense of harmony, can also be linked to the idea of justice, in the way Plato defined it so clearly in his dialogue The Republic. Shortly, that everyone has its rightful place in society, that each part has its proper place in the whole. And this can be achieved, this idea of justice, if everyone gives what one can to the whole, and thus also receives from the whole what one needs. And it also means that peace or harmony is a dynamic thing and requires continuous and active attention for the whole. So it is much more than a state of just not having to fear for your life. It is contributing to the whole and continuously looking to see in what way the whole can use your input as a part. Just as in a good team, people don't just do their own job and nothing else, but keep an eye on the whole and step in for others when necessary. And that can only work well if you are connected and also have an eye for the whole, for unity and for coherence. And that implies that in general these higher thinking aspects also have to be the leading aspects. So that sense of unity, sense of coherence, understanding, those make those leading in your thinking, and other aspects more serving those leading aspects. So to summarize, we said the free will is the inherent divine power in every being to choose, and that freedom can shortly be defined as the ability to express one's free will, or the development of consciousness. And peace equals harmony as the right interplay of action and reaction in every situation. And to be able to do that, one needs to express as much of those 7 aspects of thinking as possible. Now, coming to harmony or peace also has everything to do with the law of karma, but as we said, that we will elaborate on in the second part. We will now have a short break of 3 minutes, and if there are any questions, we also have room for that. So see you in a few minutes.